September the 11th, 2001. A day remembered for the worst terrorist atrocity in living memory. Hijackers fly planes into the World Trade Center towers. Before the day was over, two questions would ring out around the world. Who was responsible, and why did these two huge buildings collapse the way they did? The first question has long been solved, but the second refuses to go away. Built to survive a direct impact by an airliner, could office fires really cause two of the world's most sophisticated buildings to collapse?
I'm just shocked, horrified. I say to myself, how could this happen?
The official report into the collapse leaves many unsatisfied. The question has spawned 1,000 conspiracy theories.
Many architects and engineers, technical and building professionals have found evidence for explosive-controlled demolition.
Now, a new theory developed independently by two scientists on either side of the Atlantic discovers missing evidence that could provide a definitive explanation. An explanation found not in the fabric of the towers, but in the airplanes themselves.
There was a bomb in the building, and it was just a matter of time before the whole thing blew up and down come the towers.
Today, all that remains of the Twin Towers, the most famous buildings that once stood in New York, are two giant footprints. Of the 2,700 victims named here, most died not when the planes hit the buildings, but as the towers collapsed. For many New Yorkers, the Freedom Tower acts as a symbol of the resilience for a city that lost so much. And for Bobby Maguire, a firefighter from Long Island, it has a very special significance.
You know, out of the 343 firefighters we lost, I lost many, many friends, and I lost my nephew. He was a probie, which means less than a year on a job, and it was his very first fire. His unit was one of the first to respond, and he was in the North Tower when it collapsed. I gotta think he was pretty high up.
Bobby arrived on the scene just as the second tower was coming down.
It was complete chaos. And then you had thousands and thousands of people running for their lives in every direction, not really knowing where to go. Reports of more planes coming in added to the confusion. I've never seen a building collapse like that before, no. It was like a pancake effect that I don't remember having any type of building, certainly nothing that size, collapse.
The 110-story World Trade Center towers had been designed to withstand the impact of a commercial jetliner. Yet within 2 hours of the attacks, both had collapsed. So why did the Twin Towers fail so disastrously in such a short space of time? Under public pressure, the US government commissioned a $16 million investigation from the National Institute of Standards and Technology in an attempt to explain the structural failures of the towers. They examined the debris from the disaster, ran hundreds of computer simulations, and conducted extensive lab tests. In October 2005, they published their conclusions. According to the report, the buildings collapsed because when the aircrafts hit, the impact dislodged the fireproofing around the building's structural steel skeleton. Unprotected from the fires, the steel frame weakened and the towers collapsed.
We say here the buildings would not have collapsed under the effects of the airplane impact and the jet fuel ignited multi-floor fires. The reason it collapsed is because the fireproofing was dislodged.
The NIST report restricted itself to finding an explanation for the sudden collapse of the steel supports on the impact floors alone. It did not deal with the subsequent and dramatic collapse of the towers. The dramatic nature of their collapse became an obsession for online conspiracy websites. One of the most prominent and controversial conspiracy sites is Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Its founder is Richard Gage.
We now have 2,200 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation of what happened at the World Trade Center complex on 9/11.
Despite Gage's opinions being offensive to many, he's attempting to gain mainstream acceptability with a combination of science and conjecture to exploit what many see as a major shortcoming in the official report.
The official report does not account for the hundreds of eyewitness testimony of explosions.
There was a heavy-duty explosion.
It was the third explosion. The whole lobby collapsed on us.
In all, over 118 New York firefighters claim they heard explosions just before the collapse of both towers, yet their testimony is not addressed in the official report.
This explosive testimony that was not released until August of 2005. It was being held by the city, but the New York Court State of Appeals forced the overturning.
For Gage, the withholding of this testimony is no accident. It is part of a cover-up. He claims that the explosions are evidence that before the aeroplanes were flown into the towers, bombs were planted inside them to guarantee their collapse.
So many architects and engineers, technical and building professionals, have found evidence for explosive-controlled demolition.
For these theorists, it is the only possible explanation for the collapse of these solid steel structures.
What we have in the World Trade Centers is massive explosions recorded by first responders traveling down the sides of the building, completely destroying the structural steel frame in 12 seconds.
Gage's claims require a high-level conspiracy. Ever since the terrorist attack in 1993, the World Trade Center buildings were among the most secure in New York. If Gage is right, explosives would have had to have been smuggled into both towers and detonated at exactly the right moment. And for many of those directly affected by the disaster, claims of government involvement are deeply offensive.
We've all heard the conspiracy theories, and be honest with you, I don't know of one single firefighter that puts any heat into that. I kind of think anyone that thinks our own government would do that is kind of out there somewhere. I certainly don't believe it. I think we all know who did this and why.
For Dr. Frank Greening, a nuclear research chemist of over 20 years, the question of government conspiracy was never an option. But there were still many aspects of the official inquiry that troubled him. And until they were explained completely, there would always be fertile ground for conspiracy theories. What he discovered was so remarkable, it not only answered the outlandish claims of the theorists, it would change our understanding of the disaster forever. The official government report into the Twin Towers tragedy only tackled events on the initial impact floors, not the physics behind the subsequent collapse. It left the field wide open for conspiracists, who proposed that the towers fell as a result of government-planned controlled demolition. Dr. Frank Greening was also surprised that the towers collapsed so quickly.
I watched this whole thing unfold like everybody did, and then of course the South Tower collapses. The top section just crushes the lower section. A little later the North Tower does the same thing, and I'm just shocked, horrified, and I say to myself, how could this happen?
He felt that until the mechanics of the collapse were properly understood, the fanatical rumors would simply not go away. He decided to calculate whether the towers could collapse under their own weight, without the need for explosives.
The first thing I felt needed to be cleared up was, could the building collapse the way we saw it, or did it actually need help from explosives, as some people were suggesting? I really threw myself into 9/11 research, and I decided I wanted to apply science, physics to studying this problem. I set up a computer program based on momentum transfer to look at each impact of each floor.
Greening's momentum transfer theory calculated the weight of the buildings above the impact floors. He discovered that if one floor failed, the weight of the higher floors would cause each floor below to give way exactly as seen.
I ran the program. It showed that the buildings would indeed come down. Even more interesting was the computer program predicted the collapse times.
The North Tower with the smaller block of floors above the impact zone fell in 13 seconds. But with a greater number of floors above the impact site of the South Tower, it took only 11 seconds.
Once the building started to collapse, there was no stopping it. It was a juggernaut. The mass of the upper block in the North Tower is equivalent to the mass of the Titanic. It's about 38,000 tons.
In 2008, his work was published in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. His results put paid to the idea of controlled explosions once and for all. But his investigation led him to question fundamental aspects of the official report.
Towers were burning away furiously. Then the fires subsided somewhat, and then suddenly out of the blue, the North Tower and the South Tower just collapsed. The question is why? What started that?
Although he had dispelled the conspiracists' ideas about controlled demolition, there was still the nagging question about the explosions heard by firefighters before the collapse. Central to his concern was their conclusion that the office fires were capable of weakening sufficient numbers of the structural steel girders to trigger collapse. Around the world, super-tall skyscrapers dominate our skyline. The pinnacle of design and engineering, these towers are built to last, and just like the Twin Towers, the key to their strength is that they are constructed around a strong steel skeleton. Structural engineer Roma Agrawal helped build Europe's tallest skyscraper, London's Shard.
The Twin Towers had two tubes, one inside the other, to form the structure. The inner tube was called the core, and it had vertical steel columns in it. The outer tube also had vertical steel columns in it, and the horizontal beams going around the building formed a lattice with those columns to keep it stable.
And this tube lattice design meant that the towers easily survived the initial impacts.
When the building was impacted by the plane, a number of the columns and the beams were severed, but because of this tube lattice system, the weight of the building could actually find a different way to go around the hole. So the impact by itself would not necessarily have caused the tower to collapse.
By redistributing the loads of the higher floors around the damaged structures, the buildings survived the plane impacts, but they did collapse, one after 56 minutes, the other 102 minutes. Something caused the surviving structural steel columns to fail.
The official report explained that the temperatures of the fires were high enough to cause the steel to lose its strength and to compromise its integrity. And this is what ultimately brought the buildings down.
No skyscraper has ever collapsed due to fire prior to 9/11.
9/11 Truth Movement founder Richard Gage didn't believe the fires could have weakened the steel structure.
The exterior perimeter structure of these towers was massive, as was the core. 47 columns, 52 inches by 22 inches. It's solid steel. There's no evidence for temperatures reaching the structural steel that could even cause the weakening of that steel.
For the skeptics, it was the fires were not that intense. They were kind of patchy at best, and they argued that insufficient heat was being supplied to the columns, and therefore there was no way a fire could weaken the steel.
Steel has been used in the construction industry for over a century. Without it, the high-rise buildings that dominate our cities would not have been possible. A man-made alloy of iron and carbon, steel offers unrivaled strength and flexibility. Manufactured to be fire-resistant, steel retains its strength in high temperatures for extended periods of time. And around the world, high-rise steel buildings have remained standing despite the most intense fire damage. So why did the steel frame of the Twin Towers fail? The 9/11 hijackers had chosen long-distance flights because fuel loads inside the jets were at a maximum 10,000 gallons. Yet most of the fuel burned off within seconds, and all within a few minutes. After that, the fires were sustained by the contents of the offices alone.
There was a lot of what engineers call fire load in the building. So materials like wood, which may have been in the flooring, the furniture and so on, provide a lot of fuel to these fires. So even after the jet fuel may have burnt out, there's lots of other stuff that can cause the fire to burn.
But were the fires hot enough to significantly weaken the steel in the short time it took the towers to collapse?
The official report explains that once the steel gets to above about 600 degrees centigrade, which is over 1,000 Fahrenheit, that it starts to lose a significant proportion of its strength. The key question is, how long does it take? So the fires might get there very, very quickly, but the steel might take a bit longer, and there's a bit of a time lag from one to the other. That time lag depends on how much protection there is on the steel.
The important steel girders inside the tower were treated with a spray-on heat-retardant concrete that would certainly have protected the steel from the fires. The official investigation recreated the conditions inside the burning buildings to check what impact the fires would have made on the protected steel. The results were surprising.
As part of the official investigation, a number of experiments were done to understand how quickly steel gets to that critical temperature where it loses a lot of its strength. And this was done when the steel was protected with this sprayed-on insulation, and it took over 10 hours.
But both towers had collapsed inside 2 hours, long before they should have. To explain the discrepancy, NIST repeated the tests without any fire protection.
When the same experiment was done without any protection on the steel at all, it took a mere 13 minutes.
The conclusion drawn by the NIST report lies at the heart of the debate. They concluded that as the steel girders gave way, substantial numbers must have lost their fireproofing. But how? The report assumed that it had been knocked off by the initial impact from the aircraft. The entire official report's conclusion hinges on this critical assumption. Without it, there is simply no way of explaining how the steel structure gave way.
The findings of the official report really rest on the question of whether the steel was protected or not, and whether that fire protection had been dislodged or not as a result of the impacts.
There are many industry experts who do not believe that the fireproofing was dislodged, throwing the conclusions of the official report into serious doubt. If the fireproofing was not dislodged, the NIST report offers no other explanation for the event that triggered the collapse, causing the deaths of so many people. Nuclear chemist Dr. Frank Greening was scouring the 10,000-page report, looking for clues that might suggest an alternative answer, when one passage caught his attention. According to the report, just 7 minutes before the South Tower fell, there were signs of explosive activity within the tower, and a glowing liquid began to pour from one of the impact floors. The liquid can be clearly seen on this video footage.
One of the most interesting clips that people discuss at great length concerning the World Trade Center collapse is this footage of the South Tower, and just before the collapse, we see a golden stream of what looks like a molten metal pouring from one of the windows.
The official report concluded the molten metal had no part to play in the collapse. But to Frank Greening, the cascade was extremely significant. It was the missing evidence he had been searching for.
I came with a chemist's perspective. I see the chemistry as the key, and I think that's what is probably the probable reason why NIST failed to consider the role of chemistry. Basically, they're not chemists.
Frank suspected that the metal seen pouring from the window is a material with a far lower melting point than steel, a metal present in huge quantities on the burning floor, and a metal extensively used in the manufacture of aircraft, aluminium. And to Frank's disbelief, he found that aircraft parts formed no part of the official investigation's extensive fire tests.
They did great tests for an office fire, and that's a huge omission in their work, and I feel until those tests are repeated with an aircraft included in the office, their results are essentially meaningless.
Could the presence of aluminium provide the trigger that led to the initial collapse of the building? Frank shared his concerns in a research paper online. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another scientist had spotted the same oversight in the official report. Christian Simonsen is a senior metallurgist at SINTEF, one of Europe's largest independent research laboratories specializing in material science. He's one of the world's foremost experts in metals, and he also published a paper in the Journal of Engineering that mirrored Frank's concerns over the short time it took for the steel structures to give way.
When I read that, 300 pages, it only had a theory about the building and how the building were overheated and that it started to crumple. I didn't believe that for 1 minute, because 1 hour is not long enough for the steel to heat up. It takes much longer time.
Working independently, both scientists had arrived at the same conclusion.
The official report was concentrating on the steel bars, but the missing element is the aircraft.
And the missing evidence, quite simply, is that there was a huge aircraft sitting inside the building.
The official report assumes that both aircraft disintegrated on impact and the debris scattered across several floors. So the aircraft wreckage was not included in any fire tests. The omission is also questioned by experts from the aviation industry.
I think it is a little surprising that they did not include anything from the aircraft in their estimates of the fire behaviour.
Dr. Guy Grattan is an aeronautical engineer. Having studied the official report, he rejects the idea that the planes disintegrated.
When the aeroplane flew into the tower, it would have hit the metal and concrete structure of the tower, would have broken up into smaller pieces, which would have come into rest.
Grattan believes that during the impact, as the planes sliced through the steel columns, substantial chunks of metal would have come to rest in the very center of the building. By excluding the aircraft from their calculations, the official report has overlooked potentially crucial evidence. If the temperatures inside the burning buildings got hot enough to melt the wreckage, the results would almost certainly have been catastrophic. And that's because under the right conditions, molten aluminium can be one of the most explosive substances in the world. Working on either side of the Atlantic, two renowned scientists, Frank Greening and Christian Simonsen, are challenging the official 9/11 report into the collapse of the Twin Towers. They both believe that by ignoring the presence of aircraft wreckage in the fires inside the Twin Towers, the report is incomplete. The presence of aircraft debris in the fires could provide a solution to the outstanding question of why so many people heard explosions prior to the collapse. Frank and Christian both believe that aluminium lies behind the eyewitness reports.
When I read about the aircraft, it was made by 30-ton aluminium, something of the same order with steel, and then some carbonite and so on, all kind of materials. And the most important part of these materials were aluminium.
Aluminium is the most abundant metal on the planet. Softer, lighter, and more flexible than iron and steel, it is the ideal material for building aircraft.
Back in the early days of commercial aviation, aircraft were manufactured from wood. By World War II, they started to pressurise aircraft and also carry a lot more payload. Wood just wasn't up to it, and aluminium and steel, particularly aluminium alloys, became the main materials that we used. For the larger aircraft structures, the fuselage, the wings, what you need is the ability to make very large, very lightweight, complex shapes. So that's why aluminium alloys are primarily used for those parts of an aeroplane. This is a typical aluminium aircraft structure. So you've got this skin a few millimetres thick. That takes the pressure difference at altitude. It also takes the bending and the basic load of all of this structure that's in here.
This incredibly flexible and versatile metal is entirely safe under normal conditions, but under extreme circumstances, aluminium can become incredibly volatile. Christian is on his way to an aluminium recycling plant near Oslo. Aluminium plants have long been aware of the extreme dangers of the metal.
After the early 1970s, with a few accidents with aluminium, people became aware of how dangerous aluminium can be under certain circumstances.
One of those circumstances is when the metal is molten. Workers at this plant know the dangers firsthand.
We have had one explosion 15 years ago, which was quite severe. Luckily, nobody was hurt or injured.
Molten aluminium is safe until it comes into contact with one of the most common substances on the planet, when it undergoes a highly explosive exothermic reaction. That substance is water. When water comes into contact with molten aluminium, the water molecules recombine, producing aluminium oxide and hydrogen, and releasing an explosive amount of energy.
If you have a closed container containing water coming together with liquid aluminium in your furnace, you can have a severe explosion.
In 2007, this aluminium factory in Manchester, Georgia was partly demolished when water seeped into the casting process.
It's very, very apparent that moisture got in.
Just a loud boom, and we had no idea what it was.
I mean, I've never heard anything like it in my life, and hope I never hear it again.
Events like these are far from isolated.
If you're a metallurgist who's dealing with aluminium, you know that there have taken place 250 explosions in aluminium cast house since 1918.
The worst explosion is probably the one in Shandong in 2007, where 16 people were killed, 61 people were injured, and there was nothing left of the factory.
Pound for pound, molten aluminium is 3 times more powerful than TNT. Each of these ingots contains the same potential explosive energy as 50 pounds of dynamite. Frank and Christian believe that there is a direct link between the explosive properties of molten aluminium and the collapse of the Twin Towers.
The weight of the aircrafts were about 100 tons. 30 tons of that were of aluminium, and those were situated all over the aircraft. They were on the outside, they were inside the wings, they were everywhere. You had some parts which were made of aluminium.
The new theory states that after the impacts, anything up to 30 tons of aluminium lay on the burning floors of the towers. And once it became molten, it potentially had the explosive force of 90 tons of TNT.
Behind that wall there is the fuselage of a large Boeing 767, which contains about 30 tons of aluminum. And I believe it started to melt and it's pouring out of the building.
Frank and Christian are convinced that the molten aluminium had the potential to bring down the Twin Towers.
There was a bomb in the building, but it was not man-made. It was made by the combination of all the ingredients that were being cooked up, and it was just a matter of time before the whole thing blew up and down come the towers.
The theory could explain several of the questions unanswered by the official report. Reacting pools of molten aluminium would explain the explosions heard by 118 firemen. The fires in the building were certainly hot enough to melt aluminium aircraft. According to the official report, 15 minutes after impact, around 40% of the fire was burning at over 700 degrees.
The main alloy used in the Boeing 767 was 2024. It's got a melting point of around 550 degrees centigrade, slightly lower than pure aluminium.
The showering metal in the footage is glowing bright yellow, and for aluminium to reach that color, it has to be heated to well over 1,000 degrees centigrade.
So I started to question, well, could it get hot enough to glow yellow? We need really hot aluminum to be convinced that this really is aluminum.
Could the fire inside the towers get intense enough to cause the aluminium to glow bright yellow? Metallurgist Christian believes that the conditions inside the Einar smelter, just outside Oslo, may have been present inside the burning floors.
My experience with aluminium smelters, with molten metal and burners, that is very close to what's happening in the Twin Towers.
At this aluminium smelter, it takes 30 minutes for 15 tons of aluminium to melt. But this metal is in a furnace perfectly engineered to intensify the temperature.
In this furnace here is one burner which is heating up the aluminium, and it's surrounded by insulation material.
Christian thinks that inside the towers, building rubble acted as insulation, recreating the conditions inside the walls of this furnace, helping to raise the temperature of the metal to 1,000 degrees.
It's very similar to the situation in New York. You have burners in the center with all the aluminium from the aircraft, and around it is about 10 centimeters insulation material, which is the building material.
The official report appears to support his theory, showing that in specific areas the temperature reached 900 degrees. Christian suspects that after crashing into the tower, the aircraft wreckage came to rest in the center of the building. On the way, the plane collects building rubble, in particular the gypsum plasterboard that formed the internal walls and paneling. The plasterboard acted just like the insulating walls in an industrial smelter, producing the heat required to create the bright yellow molten metal seen pouring down the building. And if the molten aluminium was cascading down the side of the building, it would also be seeping through the fractures in the damaged floor below. The only ingredient needed now to create the conditions for a colossal explosion is water. But was there enough water in both of the Twin Towers to react with the molten aluminium to bring the towers down?
They had sprinkler device in every room.
So the sprinkler device will come into action because there has been nothing wrong in those rooms.
Inside the Twin Towers, 30,000 gallons of water was spread throughout the buildings. In the event of fire, the sprinkler system was designed to pump hundreds of gallons onto the burning floors. Could it be that the system designed to prevent disaster was the very thing that destroyed them? According to the official report, the sprinkler system on the crash floors was damaged in the aircraft impacts. However, eyewitness reports confirm that on the floors below, the sprinkler systems were pumping out gallons of water. And as Frank points out, the sprinkler system wasn't the only available source of water.
There's the water to washrooms, kitchenettes, there's water bottles, there's Coke machines, all being smashed. There was plenty of water.
But water isn't the only danger. There are other substances which contain the components of water, oxygen and hydrogen, that also react with molten aluminium. Among them are lime, iron oxide, and gypsum, and they were all present in abundance inside the towers.
Those are precisely the elements that are present in the World Trade Center. The gypsum is gyprock, wallboard, plasterboard. That was all over the building. There's iron oxide on the steel beams. Then you have concrete in abundance.
Both towers were packed with multiple reactants, all or any of which could trigger the largest molten aluminium explosion in history. Christian and Frank believe they have an answer to why and how the towers collapsed. An answer that can explain both the molten metal pouring from the building and the explosions heard by witnesses in the moments before the collapse. Their theory goes like this. On impact, the steel frame of the towers cut the aircraft into large sections. And inside the burning floors, the building debris collected to form an insulating wall around the aircraft wreckage. In under an hour, the fires reached furnace-like temperatures of 1,000 degrees. At 700 degrees above its melting point, the aluminium not only becomes molten but also flows like water. Finding cracks and holes in the damaged floor, the molten metal cascades downwards, where it lands in the pools of water from the sprinkler systems on the floor below.
Molten aluminium will react with the water underneath, and you get a huge explosion.
Like a bomb going off. At that point, the collapse is inevitable.
If Frank and Christian are right, then aluminium is the cause of the explosions heard by firefighters, and the reason why the buildings collapsed in such a surprisingly short time. All they need now is physical evidence, and that lies in the rubble of the towers. Nuclear chemist Frank Greening and metallurgist Christian Simonsen believed that by ignoring the explosive properties of the aircraft's fuselage within the burning towers, the official report missed the true cause of the collapse, one of the most explosive metals on Earth, molten aluminium. But the explosive reaction requires water, and in the floors below the fires, there was water in abundance. Up until now, Frank and Christian have collaborated long distance. At a memorial for the firefighters who lost their lives on 9/11, they meet for the first time.
The view is beautiful.
It sure is. That's someone that would be about my age. I was born in 1947.
Marianne Simon, Jennifer Lynn, Stephen Gerard Siller.
To me, the amazing thing about what happened in the collapse of the Twin Towers was you had all these ingredients that were thrown together that had a terrible consequence. You had aluminum that became molten, you had water, and then you had the catalysts, you had iron oxide, you had gypsum, you had crushed concrete. Those are the key ingredients for a terrible explosion.
but the majority of the debris was put into landfill. What remains is now in the possession of the New York Port Authority. If there was an aluminium explosion, then the debris must contain the telltale droplets of exploded aluminium oxide. Missing Evidence approached the Port Authority with a request to search for the alloy. But they refused access to any material from the site. Someday, Frank and Christian hope to fully test their theory. But until the Port Authority give access to the remaining debris, the truth behind the collapse of the Twin Towers may never be known. Missing Evidence also approached NIST, the body responsible for the official report, to comment on Frank and Christian's theory. NIST stood by their claim that the aircraft had disintegrated on impact. Any molten aluminium, they said, would have flowed downward and quickly re-solidified. At the time of the collapse, no liquid aluminium would have been available to react with water. Frank is disappointed with NIST's response. Video taken clearly shows molten metal pouring from the South Tower moments before the collapse.
Just behind this stream in the building is the aircraft. And it's sitting right in the fire, which is extremely hot, and there's certainly enough heat to melt the aluminum.
Not only does their response contradict the visual evidence, it contradicts the conclusions of their own report. In a crucial paragraph, they state that the likely source of the metal pouring from the building in the 7 minutes before the collapse was molten aluminium.
I agree with NIST that this is most probably molten aluminum. What's interesting is that NIST just say, there it is, and see no further significance. I say this is extremely significant.
Frank believes that the failure to investigate the role of molten aluminium in the collapse of both towers is a critical failure of the report, one which has opened the door to outlandish conspiracy theories. Only the presence of aluminium can explain the multiple explosions heard prior to the collapse of the towers.
There was a heavy-duty explosion.
The third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
This guy's still trapped. We couldn't get to him.
Until samples of the aircraft are identified and analysed, Frank and Christian believe that the conspiracy theories will never go away.
There's 60 tons of aircraft missing. Without that, you're never going to reach a definitive answer as to what caused those towers to collapse.
And those who lost friends and family deserve to know what really happened.
Out of the 343 firefighters we lost, over 40 of them were personal friends, and one was my nephew. I think if they did have an inquiry regarding what really happened and what caused the collapse, I think it would be great, especially if it would shut up these imbeciles that believe in a conspiracy theory.
In science, there's a very useful principle called Occam's razor, which says that in developing a theory, keep it simple. I believe that in the case of the World Trade Center, we had molten aluminum, we had a fire, we had everything you need to create a terrible explosion and bring down the buildings. That's the simplest solution, and I believe it's the correct solution. You will never sort out what happened until you include molten aluminum in your analysis.
Next tonight on Channel 5, Democracy with a Gangster Twist. Gordon and Bullock are on the case when the dark and devilish new series of Gotham continues right after Monday night's lines.